The old and historic buildings in Halifax are much more than just pretty facades. They tell a story of the rich history behind this city. But have you ever thought about what kind of story that they're telling? Or who's left out of it?
Unreroute the river, let the damn water beat. There's some people down the way that's thirsty, so let the liquid spirit free. The folk are thirsty because of man's unnatural hand. Watch what happens when the people catch wind of water hitting the bank.
History runs deep in Halifax, and as the municipality is planning for its future through the Centre Plan, a large consideration is how we incorporate that history into the city's future. Now, this isn't the first time we've considered policies on heritage in Halifax. In the 1970s, we protected views from the Citadel to the harbour by not allowing tall buildings to be developed in front of it. We created heritage streetscapes through the 80s and 90s. In 2009, we established a heritage conservation district along a stretch of Barrington Street, and will soon be making more of Barrington and the Schmidtville neighborhood into these conservation districts as well. We also protect many older buildings by registering them as heritage properties. You might recognize this plaque near building entrances. Now, these policies have helped protect some of the buildings that define part of our history. I'm from Langley, BC, which looks like this, so I always look forward to seeing the historical architecture in Halifax. And I'm not alone. Hundreds of thousands of tourists visit Halifax each year, and I don't think they're here for pizza and donaires. But beyond significant buildings and forts, what we choose to preserve as our heritage does come with some cultural and political implications. Dr. Lachlan Barber at Hong Kong Baptist University studies cultural geography, and he's written a paper on how heritage is valued and understood in Halifax.
I think a really fundamental thing is that heritage doesn't just exist. It's something that is selected and defined. And what we have come to know of as heritage in Halifax has in some ways displaced things and people that were part of the landscape and part of the land.
What you find is that the historical aesthetic that we protect and celebrate mostly tells the narrative of European colonialism and settlement, but that's not the whole story.
Well, we'll start by saying that the history of Mi'kmaq people is not well covered here in the province. When I was going to school, we were taught that they were nomadic and just kind of wandered all over.
Okay, yeah.
But that's hardly the case, because if you look at some of their early pre-contact technology, like I say, their strategies and plans are very deliberate and well organized on a river system.
When Halifax was founded, 1749, there were black people in Halifax at that time. When the French were occupying Louisbourg, the Fortress of Louisbourg, they had over 300 enslaved Africans there in Louisbourg.
We have all of this history that talks, especially when you look at the Loyalists and the Maroons and the refugees, of hundreds of years of the presence of people of African descent being here. But yet, according to our history, there has been no presence, and we've done nothing. If you look at what's advertised for our history, if you look at tourism and the pictures that they show of why you'd want to come here, you would not think that there are people here who are not of European descent.
There's a lot of history that takes the backseat when it comes to our heritage policies, definitely more than I can fit into one video. And if I'm honest with you, a lot of it isn't stuff that we should be too proud of. We're talking about genocide, racism, slavery, and forced relocations. But what I find more unsettling is how our discussions of heritage add to that suppression. According to Dr. Barber, much of Halifax's heritage policies from the 1970s were designed with input from white, educated, middle-class professionals who were already well-versed and interested in municipal politics. And the result of all that? Well, we preserved views from the Halifax Citadel, but we weren't able to preserve the low-income homes at its northeast base when the Cogswell Interchange was being built. We kept the historical buildings on Barrington Street, but at the same time, we pretty much tore down a whole African Nova Scotian community in the North End. You know the saying, history is written by the victors? Well, I'd elaborate and say that history is written by those that have the privilege to do so. Now, in case I've gotten a lot of people really mad at me, heritage buildings are not the problem here. In fact, they currently need all the help they can get from being demolished for redevelopment, sometimes with people still living in them. Like, what the heck, man? But what I am saying is that there's a lot of other history that might not be associated with a building, but that absolutely deserves our attention.
Well, there's a difference between material heritage or tangible heritage and intangible heritage. And so intangible heritage is, of course, things that you can't touch. There are things like language and festivals and traditions. And I think we can ask questions about that. Are there things that are intangible, that are part of life in Halifax, that should be thought of in that same way?
But on top of that, it's quite evident that our established narratives of heritage need to be challenged and improved.
I think we're kind of selfish in our thinking when, the assumption that the first people who settle land leave their imprint on it, right? We have to recognize, number one, that there were people here prior to 1749, the founding of Halifax.
So you have to tell the whole story. You can't tell the little bits and pieces and only celebrate the fun stuff, because then you don't appreciate it.
Right, it's not just the history of sort of our successes.
No, you have to have the struggle that goes along with it. And unfortunately, for a long time as a country, we were kind of good at putting that stuff aside. Anything that looked negative, we'll put aside. But to me, I think it enhances the story.
The good news is that a lot of future policies, such as the Senate Plan and the Culture and Heritage Priorities Plan, are considering other ways of recognizing heritage in addition to protecting buildings. There's a lot we can change moving forward, and it's important that you're involved and represented in it. And that's what I love about history. It's so much more than remembering events of the past, preserving buildings or objects, or for attracting tourists for that matter. Our history and the way we talk about it is ultimately a reflection of our present culture. It's about what we value, what we've learned from, and what kind of legacy we want to leave in the future. And I think that's a conversation worth revisiting again and again. We're PLANifax, and that's a wrap. Or a diner.
When you talk about how do you celebrate, how do you acknowledge, and how do you ensure succeeding generations, a walking tour of an African Canadian or Nova Scotian walking tour of Halifax, where on that corner of Falkland and Gottingen, you have a bronze plaque that says this is where the AME Church stood. That further up Gottingen Street, where Viola Desmond would have had her beauty salon, you have a plaque there that shows that's